Hey folks, and welcome to the 2024 video project. For those of you who watched the 2023 project, it's a similar experience. This video is a written collection of every game I played over the last year. I tried a lot of games in 2024, and if I enjoyed my time with a game, I played it for an hour before writing about my experience and turning it into a video. It's like the impressions videos I used to make for my channel years ago, where I'd play a game for a set amount of time before discussing what it is, what I liked about it, and if I wanted to continue or not. The main difference in this collection, aside from only giving an hour to each game, is that if a game wasn't doing anything for me, I stopped playing before the hour was up, and you won't find it here. I played a lot of the heavy hitters this year, but most of the collection is indie games, as they always looked the most interesting to me after watching their trailers. And just like last year, I didn't limit myself to games only released in 2024. I bought myself a PS5 and used the PS Plus subscription to try not only modern hits on the console, but a couple games I've always wanted to play, given that I missed the entire PS4 era. And of course, there's always the games from the past year or two that I miss checking out for one reason or another. The games featured are all in chronological order, and each review averages around 3 minutes in length. I'll signal each new year as we make our way into the present. Watch one video at a time, a few of them, or binge the whole thing in one sitting. Viewer's choice. Just be sure to let me know what you think down in the comments. I hope you enjoy my thoughts and feelings on the 47 games I played in 2024. We'll kick things off with the main reason I wanted access to the PS4 library for all these years: Bloodborne. Better late than never, right? I missed the PS4 generation, and one of the reasons I wanted to get a PS5 was to play the two PS4 games I've always wanted to try. Bloodborne is one of them, the other will show up a little later. I've watched a lot of game critics talk about Bloodborne over the years, and I was worried about its aggression and difficulty. What I wasn't expecting is how empowering it is. I mean, yeah, there are hordes of enemies that can swarm you, causing panic and likely death, but unlike the other Souls games, where aggressive flailing was often a recipe for disaster, here it can be a saving grace. It's that wonderful rally mechanic everyone's talked about. Being able to earn your health back by laying into the enemy incentivizes a more devil-may-care attitude. Backing off is often the wrong move. The flailing is also great for unpredictable attacks, like how the dogs will leap to the side just when you think an attack is going to land. Now, during moments of ambushed panic, the lock-on didn't always work in my favor, but you don't need to lock onto an enemy to lay into them. It just helps. I sadly didn't get to a boss in my hour of play, but I think I was close. Once I hit the bridge, there were so many directions to travel in and areas to explore. I loved the atmosphere of Yharnam, the way the streets twist and loop back on themselves, and how light sources or a faint rambling will lead towards hidden items or someone to talk to, even if they, more often than not, tell you to bugger off. I learned how useful Molotovs are, and started to experiment with the dual modes of the trick weapon I chose, as well as the gun. I honestly wasn't expecting to enjoy the game this much, considering how punishing and frustrating I found other Souls games in the past. I think it's that despite a quicker pace and greater odds, the game feels like it wants you to dominate this world. You are a hunter after all. I'm definitely looking forward to returning to the hunt, hopefully soon. When you play a beautiful abstract indie game, be sure to have the word trauma on your bingo card. I'm not throwing shade. I just notice it a lot these days. When working out your issues through a creative project manifests as something as visually rich as Bound, there's no way I can fault the creators for using games as their form of expression. I've never played a character that moves like the protagonist of Bound. They're a dancer, and all their movements are full of grace and fluidity. There are buttons to roll, to cartwheel, and to jump. Yes, the game takes advantage of all this movement, but it's enjoyable to just move around the space, chaining together gymnastics and enjoying the spectacle. I use the word spectacle because alongside the dancer's polygonal attire, which changes color depending on the level, what is going on in the background often has to be seen to be believed. A sea of abstract shapes, churning and broiling over in the distance, while the walls and floors of the suspended structures in the foreground pulse and shift as you dance through them. And this is even before the game makes you aware of the dance button, which is the way to travel through peril without getting hurt. It's the only way to not crumple over in terror when the monster of the kingdom screams at you. And it's the only way to free yourself from being bound in the drama of these opposing parental figures. Don't you love metaphors? As we make our way through the stages, there are fragments of memory to collect that add to the collages we witness at the end. And every now and then, we enter a still of a memory ourselves. This is all contained in the notebook and imagination of a pregnant lady on a beach looking through her sketches that detail this story. It feels like in my hour I saw most of the tricks Bound has to offer, and it also feels like there's not too much game left. However, if the rest of it is as visually rich as what I played through, I cannot wait to see this through to the end. For most of my hour with The Last Guardian, I had a lot of doubts. The controls didn't work the way I wanted them to. It was hard to parse what the game wanted from me, and the biggest transgression was that it was easy to miss moments when Trico would make a spectacular jump into a new area. First, I missed when Trico jumped in the pool of water because I ran back to get more food. Then I wanted to watch it jump its way along the rock spires, but since it was following the boy, I had to manually put the camera behind me or off to the side as I shimmied along the rock wall, which was never ideal. Finally, I wanted to call Trico up to this hole in the ceiling, but as I didn't hear anything after my calls, I went running down the stairs to see if there was something else I needed to do, and before I knew it, Trico was following me down those stairs. At least I was able to catch the leap into the forest. And the more I played, the more invested I became. Despite the controller popping up on screen to show you how to interact with the world, or the voice of the old man talking about his adventure, the actual meat of the experience, the traversal from one section of the world to the next, is as good as it's ever been in a Fumito Ueda game. Because of how annoying I found controlling the boy in the first 10 to 15 minutes, I wondered if this style of play might be something we left behind for good reason in the 2000s, The Last Guardian having a ridiculously long development cycle. What changed my mind is how fluid play became once I got into the groove of how the game operated. I was gaining an understanding of the world, of learning the textual language needed to progress through this adventure. By the time I reached the forest and my alarm went off, I was completely on board. I already felt a protective bond over Trico, wanting to help it to safety, and I want to see what surprises, whether mechanical or architectural, the game has in store for me next. Whether I end up enjoying it more than Shadow of the Colossus remains to be seen, but I'm excited to find out. Yep, It's a David Cage game. I enjoyed Indigo Prophecy and Heavy Rain when they came out. There was something about the structure, always switching to new characters as the story played out in small portions, that kept me wanting to see what would happen next. The thing that struck me while playing Detroit Become Human is how Cage delights in the player performing mundane actions. There's this extended sequence where Android Kara is cleaning both floors of a house that hasn't been looked after. We go from room to room, tidying up, washing dishes, opening windows, all with a similar control scheme to Heavy Rain that is both simple yet somehow convoluted. And I think the mundanity is the core of the game, as opposed to the tense intro where the android Connor is engaging in hostage negotiations. After that setup, we walk through the city to buy paint, we clean the aforementioned house, and then we help an infirmed man eat breakfast. Sure, you can argue the game is setting up its characters, but it seems like this is what Detroit wants to focus on, the details and what's going on in the background. The protesters on the street corner, the unpaid bills on the landing, all to give the idea of how integrated androids have become daily life, and yet how much friction there is. And I'm not in any hurry to find out the scope or ambitions of Detroit Become Human. There is a curiosity to see what the overarching story is, and I have to admit the visuals are breathtaking, even all these years later. Maybe I'll return to it when I've played everything else I want to on the PS5. From my understanding, Steins Gate Elite was an experiment to try and evolve the visual novel genre by creating one that was fully animated. But since the costs for doing that would be prohibitive for most studios, they remade Steins Gate so they could use the footage from the anime adaptation. Steins Gate got me back into watching anime in 2013 after a long hiatus, and while it's been just over a decade, I still remember a lot about it, and I think that polluted my enjoyment of the first hour with this visual novel. The first episode of the Steins Gate anime has a lot of intriguing hooks. The death of Kurisu Mikise, the talk of John Titor, and how pressing send on an email erases the public, leaving Rentaro Okabe alone, a satellite having crashed into the building he was just in. I'm sure the longer I played, I would have recalled more moments from the anime, but here's where I got frustrated. In general visual novel fashion, there's a lot of expository dialogue, so the voiced lines and animated scenes are interspersed with still frames and text. Many times throughout the prologue I thought to myself, man, I should just go rewatch the anime, at least that moves at a snappier pace. But I tried to not be dismissive, and by the end, I was a little more on board. Steins Gate Elite occupies a middle ground between the visual novel and the anime. I think this is to its benefit, as it has the ability to impart more information. I liked that during the section where Mayuri was at the capsule machines, I could press select and gain more information on the anime these toys were based on, explaining how this anime teaches kids about the internet and issues that arise online. That added to my knowledge of the world, and I wondered just how much interesting extra information I would get by continuing to play. I guess when I heard it was an animated visual novel, I expected it to essentially be the anime, and that was a silly assumption to make. This is still a visual novel, and once I finally understood that and what benefits it can add to this story I enjoyed a decade ago, my frustrations for the overwriting and slow text scrolls evaporated. I'm still skeptical whether or not this or anonymous code, which I covered in last year's video, can make me a fan of the visual novel genre, but I'm willing to play through both of them to find out. Last year, I tried to play Pathologic. After about 3 hours, I gave up. I found the game too frustrating to come to terms with. But ever since that attempt, I haven't stopped thinking about it. I thought the best course of action would be to try the sequel, as it's kind of a remake, and see how that fares. If I like it enough, I can always go back to the original afterwards and try again. Pathologic 2 succeeds more than the first game at easing the player into its systems and the dreamlike oddities of its world. It starts near the end of the game before moving back to a train ride towards the town. Our character, a doctor, is having strange dreams, and we get to inhabit these dreams as the basics of play are taught. Then we arrive and find ourselves killing some attackers in self-defense. Because of this and another tragedy, the town is starting to riot, and they're looking for us. It didn't take long to make connections with the underground and to understand that avoiding the majority of the townsfolk will be an important part of playing the game. What kept me thinking about the original game, and what's still a strong aspect of Pathologic 2, is the atmosphere. The catchy yet disconcerting music, the sound effects that have me looking over my shoulder, the strange creatures showing up everywhere, and the writing. Talking to folks will showcase an uncomfortable close-up of their heads. If they're a main character, they'll speak a cryptic line.
Words are neither priceless nor worthless. They are only their purpose.
And all the conversation feels like both you as the player and the character you're controlling are missing key context. This is not a normal town, and it's not full of normal people. This psychological feeling of being off-kilter feeds a curiosity I have, to want to learn more about how to survive and thrive in this game world, if that's even possible. Especially since survival is such an important part of the gameplay. I dislike survival games, having to manage status bars to stave off death and negative penalties. The bars we have here are hunger, thirst, exhaustion, health, and immunity. Most of my time with the game was searching for a friend so I could use their bed to sleep. I did not find myself a bed, and wondered how high that exhaustion bar was going to get. Hunger and thirst was easier to manage, though I can already see that food is going to become scarce as the game continues, and I'm sure I'll find out about immunity soon enough. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing if Pathologic 2 has been streamlined enough to get me on board. I'm already sold on the vibes, but I need to know that I can keep making progress, because the systems themselves are less interesting to me than the world that these systems take place in. What a lovely platformer to show off the capabilities of the PS5, while also celebrating the previous generations of Sony hardware. I like how it doesn't ask much of the player. No challenge is too taxing, checkpointing is generous, and it's fun to explore off the beaten path to get either a puzzle piece or an artifact. There's also a hangout factor. In areas like the beach of the cooling zone, or later on skating around on the ice, there's a desire to explore the entire area to either see all the cute animations of Astro, or to check out what all the other bots are up to. Many are being filmed dressed up as popular game characters, and I smiled and chuckled at their antics. There's also a nostalgia at play. The first zone I completed was the PS2 area, and hearing the load-up sound and seeing the floating blocks in the distance brought back pleasant memories. When it comes to some of the music choices, especially the ones with lyrics, I was less enthusiastic. Despite how nice everything sounds with the 3D audio through my headphones. And the parts of the game focusing on the gimmicks of the controller, like the motion controls or the touchpad, didn't work for me. It's not as precise as the controls for the rest of the game, so it was always a disconnect, even if I did find the monkey climbing kinda cool. After writing this, I spent another gaming session completing the game. Great final boss, by the way, and collected all the artifacts. It was a great time. There's a lot of heart put into Astro's Playroom, seeing it's essentially a tutorial for everything this console can do. I am amazed how good Quake still feels to play. Some of that is because when I first played it, I was just using a keyboard instead of WASD and mouse look, but a lot of it is the atmosphere. I got a few levels into Episode 2, and while Episode 1 was mostly straightforward yet abstract structures, Episode 2 is interconnected. There's a lot more lock and key going on. It feels like a planned space, but yet it doesn't. When I got lost or am looking for a corridor I haven't traveled down, the spaces I have already trodden feel familiar and a map starts to form in my head, even though the layout itself doesn't make much sense. On top of this level design, you have the monster placement, the accumulation and resource management of powerful weapons, and the understated music and sound design. It echoes plain Doom, where you can hear the grunt of a monster nearby, but instead of the high-octane metal music accompanying the demon blasting, the soundtrack of Quake is ambient and eerie. I always felt on edge, cautiously hitting F5 after each encounter survived. I actually haven't played Quake since the mid-90s. I became interested in trying out the remasters for Quake 1 and 2 after watching Noah Caldwell-Gervais's critique on the series late last year. The game still looks fantastic, and whatever has been done to enhance the art style works, because my brain felt like I was just playing a version of the original that works on modern hardware. I could see myself having a good time playing through the whole campaign and dreading each new level. By this point in the game, the designers were devious with how they would throw out a shambler in the most inopportune of places. I'm not afraid to say, dear viewer, that the tension made me quake. Unsighted is one of those games that does everything right. I loved the look of it. The music was nice, and the combat and exploration is satisfying. That parry is sick. But for some reason, I just wasn't feeling it. I mean, I was enjoying myself while I was playing it. But yeah, I wonder if it's the way it feels like a solid Metroid game of exploration and unlocks, but peppers in too much story, which is strange because I love the character design, and the writing is decent enough. I'm sure I could play through it and have a great time, but it's not screaming at me to be played, you know? Ah well, let's at least talk about the parry. Initially, it was cool that I could stun enemies with a successful parry or send their projectiles back at them, but it's in the first boss fight where the system really shines. The boss will attack multiple times in a row, and it's only after deflecting the entire onslaught that the enemy is stunned and you can get your critical hit in. This is even more bonkers because soon enough a second boss enters the fray. With multiple enemies, there's a madness to deflecting everything around you that is highly satisfying, as long as you're successful in your defense. I only attended the first parry's training session because I wanted to see more of the game, but I'm interested to see how this mechanic is explored throughout the game's runtime. As a Metroidvania, a lot of the genre's hooks are present. Craftable and upgradable weapons, slots for active and passive modifiers, finding new abilities that opens up new areas to explore, and a whole lot of optional treasure chests to open. Oh, and each character in the game is on a timer. If it runs out, they die and go hollow, or unsighted as it's called in this world. Wait a minute, awesome parry mechanic? NPCs dying if the player is having too much trouble? This is just a pixel art Metroidvania Sekiro, isn't it? How do I not want to continue with this? Well, I've learned to trust the vibes a game is giving me despite evidence to the contrary. Sentinels is one of those games I've heard good things about for years. I always hoped it would get a PC release, but no dice. Luckily, these days, I have a Switch and picked it up in a sale for a song. So is it as good as I heard it is? Kind of! Sometimes you can see how a lot of little decisions add up to something greater. I love the UI and design choices of the game. How the subtitles appear over the characters' heads. How there's a thought screen where you can gain more information, either just thinking about the topic or asking another character about it, like a point-and-click adventure game. I loved how the school scenes are always aglow in an afternoon haze, even in the middle of the day. I was inspired by the lighting, the washed-out painted look of the locations and the characters. The animation and posing are a little wonky, and I was rolling my eyes when the nurse entered, but the strengths outweigh the weaknesses when it comes to the art and design. The music was nice, and I liked the English voice acting. Oh, and the couple of fights I got to play through were cool. Turn-based RPG mecha kaiju battles. Yeah! The only negative was the pacing. It was better once the premise made itself known, and once the characters started to flesh out. But I admit I almost stopped playing during the first 5 to 10 minutes just because of how much dialogue there was, how I didn't know what was going on, and that I didn't find the characters endearing. It's only once I learned about the thought system and how we'd be playing the game from the perspectives of multiple characters in multiple time periods that I started to perk up. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim feels like a slow burn. If you can push through the beginning and give the game enough time to interest you, it feels like by the end you'll love what this ends up being. I think I've been hooked, so I'm looking forward to see where this tale takes me. I didn't notice the displayed length of each episode when I started playing Are OFK. I paused to take a break in the middle of it, and I was greeted with what looked like a progress bar on Netflix. It then dawned on me that this would be like playing through episodes of a short streaming miniseries. It's effective too. By the end of the first episode, I had grown to like Itsumi, Luca, Carter, and Jay. The game helps this along by swapping control between them, although this first episode was centered around Itsumi and Luca. Now, when I say control, I mean choosing how to respond to text messages on their phone. There are scenes with the characters interacting in their day-to-day lives, but they spend most of their time interacting through text messages. What this lack of meaningful interactivity accomplished is that it was impactful when a music video started playing at an emotionally vulnerable moment for one of our characters, and I got to control them through a series of simple games. I'd never considered how engaging even simple interactivity can be when a game is held back on it for the majority of its runtime. I don't want to talk too much about the story, as I want those interested to enjoy the ride for themselves. What I'll say is it's about 4 young people in LA who are trying to sort out their lives and follow their dreams. They have baggage and hardships, and by the end of the first episode, I cared about them, wanted happiness for them, and wanted to see what happens next. The art style took a while to grow on me, but the writing and music is excellent. It also shows that with the right framing, episodic gaming can work, even though I wouldn't have touched this until the entire season was out. Not too different from how I prefer waiting until a season of television is finished before I take the plunge. No More Heroes 3 assaults the player. References to video games and movies, slick scene transitions, bombastic color, tongue-in-cheek dialogue, and the basics of how to play. It's all tossed in a blender, supercharged, and vomited at the screen. It sounds like it'd be a bit much, doesn't it? But maybe that I've played other Grasshopper manufacturer games is the reason it feels quaint. It's still cool, but I've come to expect it. More than anything, it's like seeing an old friend after a long absence. Yes, Suda, throw all your passions into this game. Let's go wild. I've played the first No More Heroes, half of the second, and I gave up Travis Strikes Again after the first level. While I understand who most of these characters are, and the general structure of how the games rank their assassinations, I don't think a new player would be lost. Maybe a little overwhelmed, but not lost. I mean, the game opens up with an animated vignette where a kid befriends an alien that crash lands on Earth, and then 20 years later, that alien has come back with all his buddies to take over the world. It doesn't get more clear-cut than that. I miss using the Wiimote to recharge the beam saber. I found holding R1 and wiggling the right analog stick annoying. Travis has many attacks and gimmicks at his disposal, and while the game teaches them all to you one after another, I forgot about a lot of them when I was fighting the first boss. I wonder if all the shouting and pretty colors is to distract from the action itself being pretty stock standard. It does feel good to hit enemies and deliver those death blows, but I imagine it wouldn't take too many combat encounters for the thrill to wear off. Now I've heard that the game is open worldish between boss fights, but the first hour only got me to the start of Assassination number 9. I do wonder how long the bravado of Travis, the references, and the general cavalier attitude of the game can sustain itself. And I guess I'll find out whenever I get around to finishing it. It's just cool to have a new Suda game to play, you know? I think it's well known that the case of the Golden Idol takes inspiration from the Curse of the Obra Dinn. Instead of a large interconnecting puzzle of death, here we have murder vignettes. Each chapter has a number of scenarios in sequential order. Each contains a murder, and we are investigating right at the point of death. We can see who killed them and how. The trick is to find out everyone's identity and how the murder took place. Oh, and then starting in Chapter 2, the victim is already dead and the murderer is nowhere to be seen. Escalation! Switching to thinking mode, we see the ability to piece together the crime, those involved, and extra information that will help solve the case. By looking at objects in the game world, we can uncover keywords to fill the thinking screen. The game defaults to having hotspots turned on, so it's easy to see what's worth taking a gander at. I liked how when we click on a person, we see what's on their person, everything they're carrying. This is a good way to make deductions, but to really piece together what's going on, you need to think beyond the clues themselves to their context. This is what tripped me up in the third scenario. I was going back and forth over these clues for minutes, my brain not making the leaps it needed. I even tried the hint system, which had me play an annoying matching game in order to access help, and it didn't even assist me. It turns out I read a clue the wrong way. Once I realized my mistake, the whole thing slotted into place. I like the start of a new scenario, when there's a new area to explore, recognizing characters from previous chapters, and of course, that cursed golden idol that always seems to make an appearance. I think I'd find piecing together these mysteries too taxing, but I appreciate how the game is put together narratively and enjoy the grotesqueness of the art style. Quite fitting for the characters involved. Every moment of Scorn feels like I'm looking at a piece of concept art. This was strongest when I stopped moving the camera, but there is an amazement in being able to traverse these spaces and see them from almost any angle I wish. Scorn might be the first game where I've spent almost as much time admiring the world as I have playing the game. Seriously, I think my mouth was gaped open for most of my hour with it. I have to thank Pim's Crypt for their excellent video on Scorn that made me give it a chance in the first place. My aversion to horror games is well documented on this channel, and I was worried that Scorn would be too tense or terrifying to appreciate the architecture and the vibe the game was going for. Luckily, this was not the case. I was so in awe of the world I found myself in and the sense of discovery in unlocking its secrets that when horror did occur, I approached it with fascination. Scorn is body horror. Flesh and bone, meat and sinew. What happens when our forms are malleable? What can we create and what atrocities can we inflict? The player character deforms themselves to gain access to the game's first puzzle, and the puzzle itself is in working out how all the mechanisms of this room and its offshoots work in tandem to get us what we need to progress. That we're subjecting another being to this process is where the horror enters the picture. I got stuck in the following area. Sometimes it's hard to know what parts of the environment you can interact with. I know that at some point combat enters the picture, which I don't know how to feel about. I was enjoying my solitary and methodical exploration of these halls, but perhaps enemies add another flavor to the experience. I'll know for sure in the future because this is definitely a game I want to see through to the end. Marvel's Midnight Suns is one of those games where you're not sure if you want to stop moving and let the dialogue play out, or continue forward and risk missing what's being said. I wonder if I'm in the minority when I say I think I prefer the characters slow walking or more cutscenes rather than this feeling of missing out. The reason I'm mentioning this up front is that there is so much conversation. In fights, out of fights, on the way to fights. I probably could have let it float in the background as I played, but I had subtitles on, so the screen was constantly reminding me of the dialogue. Some of it was amusing, but most of it felt like it could have been said in less words. So, a Marvel XCOM game, eh? A deck builder XCOM game, and one that looks to be focused around status effects and environmental hazards. The early skills of Doctor Strange showcase this, slinging a foe either into a buddy or part of the level, with entertainingly disastrous effects. In the first real mission, I knocked an elite unit into an electrical unit, and that stunned him for one round, before I had Strange unleash his full fury on the poor fool. While the combat is slow-paced, the attacks feel satisfying. I just wonder if watching all these animations play out will start to grate after you've seen them 100 times or more. And while I wasn't as distracted by the low frame rate and drab visuals in the fights, they made themselves all too obvious in the cutscenes. What gives? I was playing this on the PS5 and it's running like this? I'd forgive it if I liked the way it looked, but I don't know. I just found the character designs and posing uninspired. I enjoyed the slick transitions as the rooms of the Abbey were explained, but really, for a superhero tactics game, I felt underwhelmed. And while the combat was enjoyable, I'm not sure if that's enough of a draw to hold my attention as the game continues. Draw. It's a card game. I'm so funny. You can't listen to the internet consensus on anything, can you? Since its release, the main thing I heard about Forspoken was that it had an annoying main character who wouldn't shut up. As someone who turns the voice volume in some games all the way down because the constant chatter of the characters gets to me, something about Forspoken's trailer ironically spoke to me. And when I saw a physical copy of the game on sale for $9, I said, what the hell? I'm glad I did, because that consensus is just flat out wrong. Yes, Frey talks a lot. She vocalizes her thoughts, and there were moments where it made me roll my eyes, but that was when she was on her own. Once the isekai happens, and she's transported to another world, her bracelet starts talking to her, and the banter between these two characters I found delightful. Heck, it even made me laugh out loud at times. After a somber intro sequence that worked in getting me to care about Frey's plight, having her whisked away to a land of magic alongside a snarky piece of jewelry is a nice change, and if the game can keep this lightheartedness up, and if it can balance it with Frey growing to be able to solve her problems, then I could see myself highly enjoying the rest of the story. The other benefit is how fun I found movement and combat. Frey gains magical abilities from her bracelet, and the first new ability the game has us unlock is a parkour flow state, where we zip around the land, flipping over any obstacle in our path. It's also used to dodge enemy attacks. My final moments with the game were fighting a dragon. It was here where I learned the push and pull between dodge and attack, nicely telegraphed by colorful flashes on the dragon itself. We start off with 3 different spells to attack with, and I gravitated towards the shield slam. It creates a stone shield that becomes offensive once an enemy hits it. Add to that a utility spell to grow aggressive flowers to harass my foes, and I already found a style of play to enjoy. If there is an upgrade tree to specialize, I can see a lot of fun in expanding this idea of defense as offense. Really, the only downside is I was waiting for the game to wow me visually. Maybe I should have tried the quality or ray tracing presets instead of performance mode on the PS5. The animations and effects of the magic are great, but the vistas and the lighting didn't do much for me. Hopefully that changes as Frey's journey continues. So yeah, I am pretty positive about my time with Forspoken. It's not something I need to play the rest of right now, but it feels like when I eventually get back to it, I'm going to have a good time. Octopath Traveller II feels like a classic JRPG. I thought a bit about Wild Arms and how that started off with intro sections for 3 different characters. And of course, I played Live Alive last year, which has a similar idea of separating a bunch of stories across a world before bringing everyone together. Seeing this is a sequel to Octopath Traveller, the format has been established. But while I never clicked with the original game, I found myself enamored with this sequel. Let's discuss why. The biggest issue with only playing an hour of a game like this is that my impression depends on picking the right starting character. I looked through all the possibilities, and while I do like playing thieves in RPGs, and the dancer sounded interesting, I decided to start with Hunter Ochette. I think that was a good choice. Her combat quirk is a bit like Pokemon. She can capture monsters and use their specialties in battle. That added a fun addition to a combat system that's already intriguing, based around using an enemy's weakness to break their will, and then boost an attack for double damage. The story wasn't too bad either. Humans and beastlings can't live peacefully because the humans are greedy and always want to expand their territory. Ochette is a hunter for her people and is obsessed with food. After rescuing a lost human child, the village falls under siege by a horrible creature, which is the harbinger of a greater calamity told in prophecy. I was in the middle of this boss fight when my alarm went off, and I said, "No, I am completing this, damn it!" I wonder if it's one of those fights you're meant to lose, but can win if you pick the right choices. I wondered this because the damn fight took forever. Maybe I could have made better decisions during the fight, or if I had captured a few other creatures it would have gone more smoothly, but trying to whittle the boss down to breakpoint when they summoned creatures to consume for an attack I had to defend against just prolonged the inevitable. At least I got comfortable with how turns work, and item usage. I almost went through my whole supply of jerky. Anyway, the fight ended, and while it was a bit too drawn out for my liking, I loved the rest of what I played of Octopath Traveller II. The turn-based combat is fun, the story is engaging, and I think the washed-out lushness of the background art is one of the game's highlights. I look forward to trying out all the other characters and hope that the game's pacing and length doesn't overstay its welcome. It's always a good sign when the gameplay becomes so engrossing that you're able to forgive a lot of a game's little faults, even if they can end up adding to big problems over time. I don't like the comic book art style of Showgunners. I find it too muddy, although considering the subject matter, that might be the point. The game ran very choppy, with a lot of loading screens and transition stutter, and in the overworld, I took far too long to key into how to disarm traps and took one too many explosions to the face. That one's on me, but it all adds up, you know? The ambush and arena battles though? That's some fun right there. I always think I need to go back and play through XCOM, but when you have games like this, maybe I should stick with the newer model. I love how Overwatch works, ending the enemy turn if you make a kill when one of them runs into your sights. I like all the little bonuses for teamwork or using the level's hazards to your advantage. The game is set in a Smash TV Running Man-esque death game show, where you're slaughtering prisoners on death row for the entertainment of the masses. And I feel the modifiers and inventive ways to dispatch those in your path being rewarded plays into the game show aesthetic, making the player want to be as entertaining as possible in enemy dispatchment. It also meant that I desperately wanted to get to the next fight. In between these fights are bonus paths leading to challenges and extra rewards. And when the episode is over, there's some explorable downtime in the studio. This may be an odd comparison, but it reminded me of the in-between mission sections of Crusader No Remorse. Anyways, as turn-based tactics games go, Showgunners is great on that front. I just hope everything else doesn't end up being a problem the further one plays. It's obscene the amount of hours I've put into Diablo 2 and 3 over the years. Yet when Diablo 4 dropped in 2023, the trailer didn't sell the game to me. I of course heard how Diablo 4 shed players soon after launch, how the persistent open world changed the feeling of the previous game's procedurally generated zones, and I was unsure if I wanted to play something that looked this grimdark. Well, almost a year later, and Diablo 4 is on Game Pass. And you know what? It really feels like Diablo. It's hard to fully articulate what I mean, but I'll try. That's the point of being a critic, right? I've said before how other ARPGs have never got me invested like Diablo has. I wondered if it was mood and polish, and certainly that plays a part, but there's something to the way Diablo itself feels to play. The rhythm and flow of the cycle of combat, acquiring of loot, and leveling up. Diablo has a gameplay loop that no other ARPG I've tried has been able to replicate, and it's one that I prefer above all others. Even though my time with Diablo 4 was short, I felt that same familiar ebb and flow at its center. As for the darkness, well, the world of Diablo has always been a grim one. But maybe it was 3's vibrant color palette, or being a lot younger when 1 and 2 came out, those not putting me off like the idea of 4 did. Maybe it's the idea of the same world rendered using current technology. I've always felt Blizzard were in a class of their own when it came to pre-rendered cutscenes, and the intro of Diablo 4, as well as the sequence of Lilith in the church, keeps that belief going. Of course, by the time my character's horse was eaten by wargs, I was itching to actually play the damn game. and luckily I soon found myself a besieged town and got to explore a dungeon. I like how each ability you can put points into has passive offshoots, enhancing said skills and thus creating a build around a preferred playstyle. By the time I finished, I had found a few weapon and armor upgrades, and my inventory was starting to fill with trash. I'm a little worried about the early introductions of what looked like a crafting system, but narrative and gameplay wise, I'm already hooked. I definitely want to play through the campaign. Of course, longtime Diablo fans know that every Diablo game is essentially two separate games, the main campaign and what comes after. That pull to find better loot and continually boost your character's power. This is why I spent all those hundreds of hours in the previous games. Will Diablo IV have a similar effect? I guess only time will tell. What a delightful game. Smushi Come Home is an example of charm winning over visual flair. I originally found Smushi and his mushroom brethren cute despite the lo-fi world, but I didn't know if I'd enjoy myself once the game started in earnest, when Smushi is swooped up by a bird and let go in another land. What started to shift my mood was gaining the ability to grip onto walls for a double jump and gliding with a leaf before letting me loose in a larger area full of fun characters and plenty to explore. The ultimate goal of this first area is to find blueberries to coax the lizard out of its tunnel, so you can continue onto the river that might lead back home. One character will exchange their blueberry for 60 green gems, and the other berry is hidden in the crystal caves. Along the way, I found myself restoring flowers to their shrines, gaining the ability to slash vines, shooting down strawberries, and having a wonderful time as I explored the world accompanied by pleasant music. Oh, and if you like mushroom trivia, every time Smushi comes across a new species, it appears in the Mushroom Journal, alongside Smushi commentary. We talk a lot about the vibes of a game these days. How beyond the look, the music, and the gameplay, there's something that all a game's elements manifest together, but yet it's somehow separate to the game itself. This ephemeral quality is always difficult to pinpoint, but we can always tell when the vibes are hitting us. With Smushi Come Home, I found the vibes immaculate. I had a smile on my face while playing it. So much that I made sure to coax the lizard out of its tunnel before I stopped playing. Sure, it may seem too cutesy or simplistic to some of you watching the footage on screen, but I'd recommend you give it a try if you like 3D platformer collectathons. I for one want to get Smushi home, if only to see what other fun interlocking puzzles across a vast world of colorful characters the game has in store for me. I didn't get to play much of Final Fantasy XVI. When it looked like the game was finally going to give me control and let me explore an area with some combat encounters, my timer went off. Still, I learned more about the game during this hour than I would have in last year's video when I was only playing games for 30 minutes. It begins with Spectacle, a fight between the Phoenix and Ifrit. Later on, we see Shiva and Titan go at it. This is medieval war, and countries have access to icons. There was a moment where we control Clive running to some semblance of safety as the battlefield crumbles around him. Shiva and Titan fighting in the distance, distorting the landscape. I wonder if I just didn't have the camera in the right place, because it felt like I was only ever seeing the fight out of the corner of my eye. We also got some political discussion that means nothing to me, because I don't know who anyone is yet. I continued to question what was going on when the story kicked back 13 years prior to a teenage Clive sparring with his master. The combat at least is engaging. It's fluid and flashy, with a strong evade window and the ability to keep pressure on an enemy with magic, or the choice to close the distance with the power of the Phoenix. I want to experience more of it. and I also want to get further along in the game so that blasted tutorial window stops popping up every time the game hands over control. As for the story, as this is in the past, things are obviously going to go wrong, and the benevolent Duke who we're serving under is likely not going to make it. As this is inspired by Game of Thrones, anyone who's actually a good person doesn't have much of a chance, do they? It was weird seeing such a dour Final Fantasy game. I mean, I wasn't expecting a light tone, but something other than a cute puppy. Oh well, I'll be making my way through this sooner or later. I'm already invested in where this flashback is going, so the story has done the work to get its hooks in me. Really, I just want an opportunity to fight more battles. I wanted to try Pseudoregalia after hearing folks rave about its movement. I'm also easily won over by an early 3D Nintendo 64 aesthetic. To start off on the right foot, I'll say that it feels like a Nintendo 64 game in terms of design. What I mean is that there's a whole castle to explore with interconnecting rooms and big doors leading to new areas. There is no map and no general objective, so it was a case of discovering and then enjoying what each new room of the castle contained. What platforming challenges, and also if I'd follow a series of rooms to a new power-up. Not that the power-ups are easy to use, that was my biggest hurdle with the game. Yes, Pseudoregalia does most of its teaching through its design, but that also means that there were moments when I was wondering what the hell the game wanted from me as I failed at a platforming challenge for the 7th time. I came so close to quitting on multiple occasions, but something kept me going, perhaps my stubbornness, and when I finally got past the challenge, it was smooth sailing, at least until the next hurdle. A good example of getting to terms with the way Pseudoregalia controls is the Sun Greaves. It enables a wall jump, of sorts. You only get 3, and the way momentum and direction work combined with camera placement made it highly frustrating to get to grips with. Another triumph of nailing down the feeling of those early 3D games. At least with the size of the castle, when I was stuck trying to use the greaves to get to higher ground, I decided to go exploring, and I found a big new area, got a couple keys, and came back, finally seeming to have an idea on how to proceed. It turns out I was stuck in an optional room, but I felt a lot more confident about dealing with this funky wall jump after conquering it. Oh, and aside from the castle being a big space to explore, it's also pretty evident when you don't have the abilities necessary to proceed when you get to a new area. I appreciate that. I think Pseudoregalia nails what it sets out to do, and I imagine mastering its odd controls leads to a feeling of accomplishment. But while I'm happy to have tried it out, I think I'll leave it like its inspirations in the past. Chants of Sennaar reminds me of Return of the Obra Dinn, mainly in the way the player has to get every element of a page right before the game will lock in the answers. In Obra Dinn, the puzzle is in using contextual clues and logical reasoning to uncover a mystery. In Chants of Sennaar, that mystery is a language. What shocked me was when the pages would appear, and if I had actually come across enough clues to fill them in. You'd think that the earlier you get shown a pictograph, the sooner you'd solve it. But as my book became filled with more and more words, I noticed how I was missing a lot of the earlier, presumably simpler ones. But the game is not just about working out the language. This feels like a point-and-click adventure game, because I was exploring the town, talking to the citizens, and along the way I was learning context for the language and how the place itself operates. This is a hierarchical society, and there are penalties for stepping out of line. There are moments when the player is in danger and has to be sneaky. But mostly I felt the joy of exploration, discovery, and trying to hold the bigger picture of the place and its language in my head as I explored every nook and cranny. Heck, there was even a Move the Boxes puzzle. I hope there's not a Tower of Hanoi. And the way the game records the language and allows the player to guess as to what each pictograph means is smooth and intuitive. I'm looking forward to returning, piecing together the whole language, and then revisiting every area with hopefully full understanding. I've always wanted to cover an idle game like Cookie Clicker, but the problem is the name of the genre itself. They're not meant to be played for long periods of time, and they generally don't provide interesting footage. However, there was something about the trailer of the Gnorp Apologue that intrigued me. I think it's the Gnorps themselves, chipping away at this infinite rock for the promise of wealth and prosperity. But all that awaits is greater technology to chip away at the rock, revealing more resources to climb ever and ever upwards with no end goal in sight. Capitalism metaphor! The Gnorps, alongside the serene music, do a lot to make waiting around less tedious. Even with cute little critters, the idle genre rewards players who step away from their computers with the game still running. Halfway through my playtime, I used the toilet and checked Discord on my phone for a few minutes, and when I returned, I was able to afford multiple upgrades. Multiple! If you manage to collect enough resources, the prestige bar will fill, granting you a point to spend on the level up screen. The game warns that this will reset things, but I thought maybe it would just take away all the resources I had accumulated. Nope, the game completely resets. I will say, this scratches an itch I've had for most of my game playing life, where I figure out how a game works and want to restart to quote, do things right this time. This compulsion is baked into the Gnorp Apologue, and you even get a point to spend on the level up screen for your troubles. It's that feeling of wanting to solve the game that's making me think about having it run in the background while I do other things. I'm asking myself questions like, what is the best ratio of runners to slammers, and how many bombers, drones, or mountaineers should one build? Unlike the rock itself, housing feels like a finite resource, so there's only so many Gnorps to go around. But this is how these games get their claws into you, isn't it? I didn't even see what all the upgrades or buildings do. I think I will be playing through this one. Well played, the Gnorp Apologue. Well played. Wow, I'm covering Persona 3 2 years in a row. You want to know what's even wilder? After playing for an hour, I ended my play session at exactly the same place that I ended Persona 3 Portable last year, only playing for 30 minutes. I have to wonder if this reflects the pacing of the PS2 original, or if it's just modern JRPG game design. I was a bit worried that my character wouldn't get their persona, as I wanted to experience a battle before my time was up. But as someone who's played a lot of Persona 4 and a little of 5, everything is familiar, and the presentation is smooth, if not as smooth as its sequels. It seems that they took the original look of the game and just polished it up. I loved the cutscene of the shadow coming over the side of the roof, and my character activating his persona for the first time. I will admit the pacing feels too slow, but the writing and voice acting is solid. These games always have long tutorials, and I have no doubt once the game lets me loose, I'll have a blast getting to know these characters while fighting shadows. Just like Persona 3 Portable, I find the concept of an extra hour where people turn into coffins and shadows roam intriguing. I have a lot of questions I want answered, and since the game looks and runs smoothly, this seems the best way to finally play through Persona 3. I wasn't expecting Banishers Ghosts of New Eden to dedicate so much time to conversation and exploration. The trailer piqued my interest as it looked like an RPG in the style of The Witcher 3, leaning heavily on faith and magic. What I wasn't expecting when the game started was for it to be historical fiction. The game is set in 1695. Antia and Red are Banishers, those who exorcise the dead, and they are heading to the town of New Eden near Boston in the new land of America. Their friend Charles has summoned them to help with a local curse, and when they arrive they already find him dead, and the town all but abandoned save for a few brave souls. Characters have motives that are uncovered by collecting hints about them. This is done through exploration. When visiting Charles's widow Esther, we find out about the couple by searching his library and bedroom, reading letters, and hearing Antia and Red converse about their old friend. This was a highlight. Antia is Red's mentor, and the game starts with them waking up from enjoying each other's company on the ship. So it's nice to have a game where the main character has someone to bounce their thoughts off of. Even when you get separated in the intro section and have to take diverging paths as the game introduces its movement and combat mechanics, they banter as their paths crisscross. It's a great dynamic. I'm sure the combat and exploring the town will open up as the game does, the first hour being very go from point A to B, but I liked how the game eased me into its world and atmosphere. In the end, that was what won me over. The slow pace of conversation and investigation with characters I was warming up to. The combat is engaging enough, if nothing new in the third-person action space, and while not blown away by the visuals, I stopped to gaze out over the docks at the expanse of its frozen lake. I can only hope the storytelling and gameplay remain engaging throughout, as I definitely want to see this tale through to the end. What fascinates me about Balatro is how engaging it is to play completely in the moment, making one choice at a time. It took me a couple games before the limits on hands and discards clicked, but even so, I was having fun buying cards, synergizing with jokers, and watching those points and multipliers explode. It probably helps that I used to play a lot of Texas Hold'em before Australia banned online poker. Even though I say that, actual poker has little to do with what's engaging here. As long as you can strategize a straight, a flush, or a full house, you're good to go. Oh man, one game I got oh so close to a royal flush. That would have been sweet. You only have so many plays to reach the blind, and if you win, you get some cash that you can spend on cards in the shop. This is where things get a bit weird and overwhelming, with tarot cards, planet cards, and even special types and modifiers on normal cards. You can buy packs and choose what to add to your deck, or save up your cash for further down the line. You can also skip any game for a bonus, but without the extra stage to grind some cash, you might be underpowered by the time you reach the boss. As with most roguelites, there's a bunch of game variations and modifiers to unlock, alongside the large amount of cards on offer. I have no doubt updates will keep growing the complexity, but for how much there is to learn and understand, the core of the game is so simple and enjoyable to play a few rounds of, that this feels like a game one can play in short sessions for months, rather than zooming through it in a week. I'm definitely looking forward to having a few games here and there, and hopefully learning Balatro's complexity through osmosis. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom is relentless. Its high energy is infectious and at times overwhelming. Hold down acceleration, slam into everything, collect the gears, and go, go, go. It's a love letter to the collectathons of the Nintendo 64 era, but all of those games were platformers. This is technically not a platformer, as the taxi doesn't have a jump button. What it does have is a dash that when used on ramps creates the approximation of a jump. The game is based around this dash jump, and many of the challenges awaiting you require precision and timing that has to be finessed through coming to terms with how the dash jump works in this game that is doing everything to get you to go as fast as possible. A good example is the second stage, which has a time limit. Additional time can be acquired through clocks, but the gimmick of the level is to cart around passengers crazy taxi style, while mowing down any other person or piece of scenery that gets in your way. I think this stage shows Yellow Taxi goes Vroom at its best, when the chaos is baked into the challenges. In Marlowe's House, or the attractions of Arcade Panic, I found the finicky nature of trying to take things slowly, creating more frustration than enjoyment. Sure, I could go collect my gears in other stages, but if I want to collect everything, I'll have to come back to these frustrating sections sooner or later. Now, the level of confidence in the game's design, look, and feel are to be commended. It's wacky, a bit tongue-in-cheek, and although there was a warning for crude humor, I only encountered one example. New levels keep opening up, and if you look at the map screen, there's so many unlocks to discover as you keep playing. While I appreciated its charm basing a whole platform's worth of game around a dash ability, I didn't enjoy the ramping up of difficulty and what the game was asking from me. But hey, at least the title tells you exactly what you're in for. Tales of Kenzera Zhao has a lot going for it. I love that it's a game based on African folklore. I love that the wrapper for the game is a story our protagonist's father wrote to help his son process his grief after he's gone. I love the game's vibrant color and music that dares you to ignore it. It also plays fluidly, Zhao gracefully double jumping, phasing through waterfalls, and engaging in combat. Every aspect has been executed well, but playing the game felt like I'm just going through the motions. That I've played this all before. Tales of Kenzera calls itself a Metroidvania, but in my time with the game, it seemed a superficial descriptor. Yes, there are hidden collectibles off the beaten path. Yes, there are optional challenge rooms. And yes, I had to unlock a new ability in order to progress the story. But it just didn't feel like a Metroidvania. Even with experience points and skill trees that upgrade the two masks of combat. That was the other letdown. The idea of switching between two masks with different strengths at any time during a fight is cool, but combat felt more like an obligation than an enjoyable part of the experience. Maybe I needed to give myself over to the combat rhythms and timing, or use the moon mask to take out the ranged foes before switching back to the sun mask and attacking the melee ones. Zhao is so graceful that I felt it was easier in most cases to stay in sun mask form and just dash around and wail on everything. All up, Tales of Kenzera Zhao wasn't an unpleasant experience. Sometimes an alternate route will open up to connect back to a previous area, and the conversations between Zhao and Kalunga the God of Death were entertaining even if they were disruptive to the gameplay. I like the idea of Zhao learning to process his grief and not let it cause him to hurt others or himself. I could see an easy and enjoyable time playing through it, but I was expecting the game to grab my attention, and it just didn't. What made me interested in pools is that it's a game inspired by the craze of liminal spaces and the backrooms, but without a monster in it. I always thought it was unfortunate that there had to be a monster when the idea of unnerving or impossible yet familiar spaces can be creepy enough on their own. And Pools delivers on this premise. These are impossible spaces, a labyrinth of indoor pools. You can smell the chlorine. The first level is more of a maze than the second, but in both I was always wondering which direction to travel in. Despite this, I never felt lost, even when I came back to an area I'd been in previously. It's because each new space is increasingly fantastical. pillars and tile, sunlight and water. Oh, but there's darkness over there. Suddenly the pillars are just a little too wide. And is that a water slide? How colorful! There's even ways to perish, with the game rewinding just before you took that wrong turn. I don't want to ruin some of the more enjoyable surprises, but look at this diving board jutting out over an endless void. Of course I had to walk off it. I have a fear of heights, and I really felt the terror of looking over the edge before plunging into the blackness below. Because of the way the game uses smaller spaces, it can look gorgeous, but some of the visual effects didn't work in larger areas. Reflections or film processing creating artifacts. Now this unreality can add to the mood, alongside the restraint of the sound design, but I would love to play this on my PS5 or on any system where I can bump the graphics sliders all the way up and walk through this world in all its glory. The thought of seeing these spaces through a machine capable of ray tracing made me smile. Finally, I'll say that I was skeptical of a game that had me walking through these liminal spaces so slowly, but the slow walk is what makes it work. Even with a run, nothing is quick. You can't dash to the end. You have to linger in these rooms, taking in the atmosphere. It shows off just how enthralling walking around and looking at virtual spaces can be, especially if the spaces are just off-putting enough to make you wonder if the developer lied about there not being a monster. One of the reasons I like JRPGs is they want to tell a story, with often the gameplay along for the ride. Not to say the gameplay isn't interesting in its own right, but when so much of the medium has treated story as an afterthought or wrapper, I appreciate the RPG and adventure game genres for this reason. That's to say that in the hour I played of Sandland, the gameplay felt like it was only there as a facilitator to the story being told. What makes this observation bizarre is that I can already see the gameplay systems slowly unveiling themselves, piled on top of each other as play continues, with the player needing to make even greater decisions towards managing their party. At the moment though, we're on an adventure. We play Beelzebub, a demon prince in a world that has been covered in desert after a cataclysm. The demons steal water from humans to survive, until an old man comes to the demon village for help, thinking he's found a spring. Beelzebub asks the Demon King for permission and goes off with his old thief friend to find it. After a short while, both their supplies and mode of transport has been lost. We learn that the human army and king are a bunch of dicks, and that a mysterious girl on a motorbike is searching for something. Now the reason Sandland caught my eye is it's based on a manga by Akira Toriyama, and this game was released not long after his untimely passing. Anyone who's played Dragon Quest or watched Dragon Ball can see his style from a mile away. His characters and technology always have a relatable charm to them, and now that I've come to terms with the way his characters look in 3D after Dragon Quest XI, I can enjoy the characters themselves. We get to play a stealth section as the old thief, beat up some bandits as a Beelzebub, and flee from a sandworm, Genji Dragon, in a car. I enjoyed each beat of the story as it happened, looking forward to what was next, hoping that JRPG bloat wouldn't poke its ugly head out of the sand. Really, the only downside is that transition from scene to scene would cause the game to lag like crazy, so action sequences like the car chase and the start of every combat encounter were not as smooth as I wanted them to be. That being said, Sandland is a journey I would like to continue. A 1000X Resist uses that storytelling device of beginning in the middle of a tale without context, jumping to another point of time that makes no sense to the player at that moment, before going back to the beginning and building what the tale actually is. I made a decision once I realized what the game was doing that I would try and detach a need to understand what was going on. that sooner or later I would either find some semblance of character and plot to grab onto, nor I wouldn't. Luckily, by the time the hour was up, I had my footing and am intrigued to see where the story goes next. I think it was due to the visual design and composition. Everything is washed out, using lighting and blocking to create impact despite a lack of visual fidelity. The sound design is similar, sparse and suggestive, with the dialogue understated. Not quite a whisper, but there is no exertion on the part of the voice actors.
It all seems like an eternity ago, doesn't it?
It creates a conversational quality, pulling me in to listen to what the Watcher and Secretary had to say as they made their way through the memories of this high school. Our character, the Watcher, is undergoing an examination process by traveling through the memories of a being they call the All-Mother as a teenage girl, long before she became this figure. There's a new virus that has everyone scared. A cult is forming, and the player needs to hop between time periods to uncover memories which they can zip to, traveling node to node to further uncover the All-Mother's interpersonal conflicts. I still don't know who I'm playing as or what's going on, but the high school chapter has captured my attention. This looks like it might be the critical darling of 2024, so I look forward to playing through it and finding out exactly why that is. I last played Braid on the PC in either 2009 or 2010. Playing the Anniversary Edition, I was shocked that it's all these years later and I still remember the solutions to many of the puzzles. Or I've gotten smarter. Or maybe I've learned to understand the language of games better. Maybe it's a mix of all three. I've been meaning to replay Braid ever since that first playthrough, not only of how clever I remembered the puzzles being and how clever I felt for solving them, but I'm a guy who doesn't listen to game soundtracks outside of playing the games they're from, and the Braid soundtrack is one of the sole exceptions. Loading up the Anniversary Edition and being once more confronted with the bleeding colors that make up the backdrop of this world transported me back to my feelings of enjoying the game all those years ago. Unfortunately, I forgot how fiddly the controls can be. It's a platformer where sadly the jump doesn't feel good. The time mechanic is supposed to alleviate this. If you screw up a jump, just rewind. The problem comes in how finicky this can be when you're trying to get the level set up perfectly to lead to a puzzle piece, or just approaching one in the first place. In World 4, where time moving forwards or backwards is tied to your left and right movement, this issue came into sharp focus. But the highs of the game do outweigh its lows. Thanks to the audio-visual design, the world is a joy to spend time in, and I still think the solution in World 2 to get the puzzle piece above and below the jigsaw is genius. As for what this version adds, apparently the developer commentary opens up a new world with new puzzles, so that's cool. I still think Braid is great. I still think of the ending whenever the concept of mechanics as metaphor floats into my mind. I just don't know if this re-release is worth it when I can go back and play the original. The quickest comparison for talking about Dread Delusion is earlier Elder Scrolls games, specifically Daggerfall and Morrowind, the giant mushrooms being present here. What made me want to try Dread Delusion after watching the trailer is how lo-fi it looked, yet how striking the choices of color were. The world is tinged by a blood moon, with green stalks of mushrooms acting as punctuations of contrast. It feels both cruel and fantastical, and even after an hour talking to characters and learning more about this place, those feelings remained. Character creation was simple, spread across 4 choices before throwing me out in the world as a prisoner, released to try and complete a task that no one thinks I'll come back from. A traitor is held up in a castle, and their mercenaries have laid waste to the Inquisition's forces, so now they're turning to prisoners. I explored the surrounding area, getting to grips with the controls. One of the hardest things to come to grips with initially was how slowly my character looked around. I upped the mouse speed, but then it was too fast when combined with the slower walk speed. It took a while to find a nice middle ground before I started exploring. Despite the archetypes presented in character creation focusing on certain skills, I think I'll be using magic, bartering, sneaking, and both melee and ranged combat as the game progresses. Each player will likely lean on a preference as I did with sneaking, but although involved, the combat was secondary to walking around the world and taking in what was around the next corner. Exploration is often rewarded with gold, potions, or other items, and while I got used to the push and pull combat, it felt like something I wanted to avoid. I fought my way through the fortress, found the person they wanted me to, they fled, and now I've been set out on a new mission to further explore the world. And that's the draw. It's a game world I don't yet have an understanding of, and learning as much as I can as I make my way through it entices me. Dread Delusion is the best RPG from 2024 I've played so far, and if you look through the chapters of this video, you'll see I played a bunch of them. They are one of my favorite genres after all. I wonder if it'll keep that spot as the year continues. Back in 2022, I played a short snippet of the original read-only memories as I was streaming my way through the itch.io Ukraine bundle. The reason it was short-lived is that I loved the vibe and premise of the game so much that I wanted to enjoy playing through it on my own terms. 2 years later, and I've still not gotten around to it. It's always the way, huh? Well, a new read-only memories game is out, and it looks just as intriguing. So I thought I'd give it a whirl. It doesn't seem like you need to have played the original. The intro is almost too slowly paced, with our protagonist ES88 stuck studying for their Neurodiver exam. You have to keep reading through the boring textbook until ES's buddy Gate appears with a friend of hers, needing the services of an Esper. Using the Neurodiver, we find ourselves in the memories of Crow, finding out why a job he was pulling off with some friends went south over a decade ago. The reason for the slow pace is I found there to be an overabundance of dialogue, even though the characters themselves had personality. I enjoyed the voice acting, especially ES88's actress, and the ideas of neurodiving and what actually ended up happening on that botched job are intriguing. I even like the puzzles. To repair memory fragments, you find objects that relate to the memory in question. It's like a simple inventory object puzzle from a point-and-click adventure game. Ultimately though, I wasn't hooked with Neurodiver like I was after 5 to 10 minutes spent with the first game. One reason is that sometimes the characters' mouths would stop moving while they were still speaking, or the dialogue would get really quiet on a line read, but really it's that after an hour, I still didn't know what the game was about. I have an idea where it will probably go based on Crow's memories and the exploration of neurodiving in general, and I guess that's enough, because I still want to play it, if just for the atmosphere. I like the vibe of the world, the music, the designs of the characters, and the characters themselves. Even if it ends up being more of a hangout game than something with grander stakes, I'm just going to finally get around to the original first. I gotta say, I'm not the hugest fan of games that drop you in a world with a few mechanics and let you figure everything out yourself. Part of it is that I never feel like I'm reading the cues the game is giving me properly, but mostly it's because I often reach a point where I have no idea what to do next, and instead of revelation and understanding, the game becomes frustrating and boring. I thought Isles of Sea and Sky was going to be that, but luckily my brain oozed its way towards understanding how to solve a few puzzles, and thus grasping some more of what the game is all about. I guess you could call this a Sokoban Metroidvania. You push blocks to ring gongs and collect keys in order to get stars. Stars are just another key, as are yellow diamonds and whatever else the game will end up throwing at you. Early on, I was happy because once you find a turtle, there are other islands to explore. I love any puzzle game that lets me go elsewhere when I'm stuck. Unfortunately, there's a fairly rigid progression through the game. I only had one other island that offered any substantive gameplay, and it wasn't until I butted my head against its puzzles for more time than was enjoyable did the island itself start to open up. It helped once I got my first new ability, and I learned for certain that previous puzzles were unsolvable until I unlocked this new way to approach interacting with certain objects. I imagine a lot of the game is like that. Seeing some of the star requirements of islands I already have access to is terrifying. How much game is there? I like the island vibe, the music is great, and once I started opening up the second island, I was enjoying myself a lot more. But that initial hurdle was a lot to overcome, and the prospect of repeating those feelings as the game ups its challenges isn't exactly filling me with a desire to return, despite liking the overall experience. What made me want to play Times and Galaxy was that it has its own theme song. I smiled as I watched the trailer. Here's a snippet.
Times and Galaxy, a solar system to explore. Times and Galaxy, arts, politics, and more. From every planet to meteor.
Great, huh? I never know what's going to make me want to cover a game from its trailer, but a sense of fun goes a long way. Aside from the silly song, I liked the idea of being a reporter, interviewing witnesses, and searching for clues in order to put a story together. In my time with the game, I covered 2 stories. The first is because there are no other available reporters, so the chief sends the intern, ReporterBot, out to cover a ship crash on the planet Og. Once things calm down, you're given a more appropriate assignment for an intern, covering a cat show. In both cases, scouring the screen for details and talking to people will uncover possible directions to take the story in, as you piece it together on the story screen. What caught my attention is I thought I was pretty thorough in my investigation, but I had a lot of possible clues grayed out. I think it's because you can only question a person once, and each dialogue choice opens or closes possibilities. But maybe I just wasn't observant enough. Each story option will have an effect on the newspaper's reputation and readership. It may be tempting to just use the clues that give the highest returns, but while covering the cat show, I found that split my article between 2 separate topics. As far as I can tell, there's no penalty for writing an article that doesn't make sense, as long as it boosts the reputation and readership stats. But I cared. I wanted to make sure my writing was consistent. Might this integrity bite me in the ass? Likely, but isn't that what being a journalist is all about? The rest of the game takes place at the paper's HQ on a spaceship. There's a large, colorful cast of characters, some friendly, some hostile, and I was looking forward to deepening my relationship with all of them. I'm not sold on the design of the aliens and the game's use of color, as well as the 2D look in a 3D space, but the writing and journalistic gameplay is enough to make me want to continue. That first investigation hinted that despite the fun tone, the game might be headed in heavier directions, and I look forward to seeing what choices ReporterBot will make when it comes to the story versus what might be morally or ethically correct. If you're going to play TerraScape, start with the scenarios instead of the high score mode. It doles out the game's systems in bite-sized chunks, instead of leaving you flailing around trying to work out how it's all put together. That's not to say there's no mystery in how the game works. One of its discoveries is that setting certain tiles next to each other in a specific pattern will merge them into a larger structure. I wish I had known that when I was just plonking tiles down willy-nilly, because while the landscape is large enough to accommodate mistakes, I never felt good seeing a screen full of unoptimized tiles. When I completed the first scenario and loaded up the next one, after a couple bad key placements, I was placing my house tiles in the right configurations for maximum points. TerraScape reminds me of Dorfromantik, which is one of about 50,000 games I need to get back to. Instead of creating the landscape yourself, here we've already got a series of floating islands, and it's up to our ingenuity to make the most of them so our kingdom can prosper. The reason all my mistakes in the first scenario are weighing on me is the same reason I keep restarting all my Civilization 6 games when I don't have a good start. I don't like looking at a game board of tiles and seeing how things could have been better. There's a push and pull between unlocking new groups of cards to play on tiles and gaining enough points through modifiers and proper placement to unlock new booster packs. The scenarios present goals to achieve, so it's nice to have at least something to work towards as I was figuring out the game. By chasing these goals, I learned about merged buildings, how to think ahead in order to place tiles more optimally, and that I could open more than one booster pack at a time, which helps when you only get some of the amount of cards you need to create the buildings you want. Early on, I was just going through the motions, but it was when the knowledge I had acquired in Scenario 1 started off Scenario 2 from a much stronger position that I was hooked. I look forward to seeing how deep the merged building rabbit hole goes and what these floating isles look like when they're populated and thriving. Dungeons of Hinterberg has a Persona game loop. The day is divided into segments. During the day, the player can explore, take in the scenery, and attempt to clear one of the 25 dungeons. While in the evening, you can travel through the town, choosing who to spend time with in order to increase your friendship score. The village of Hinterberg is nestled in the Austrian Alps and is rich in tourism because magic appeared here a few years ago along with monsters and treasure. I did mention dungeons. It's attracted anyone who wants to escape the humdrum of their turgid existence and live out a fantasy, while enjoying all the local amenities and culture that such a tourist destination provides. I made it to noon on day 3 in my hour of play. In that time, Louisa almost didn't make it out of the beginner dungeon, gained magical powers, and bested the abandoned mine before spending the evening with a hipster journalist. On my way to the dungeons, I marveled at the vistas. The art style reminds me of Sable, and I can see why the game recommends spending an afternoon just taking in the sights. Similar to the school year in Persona, your vacation away from your job can only last so long, and I wonder if it might take more than one attempt through the game to clear out all the dungeons, plus whatever else the game might throw our way. It did take a while for Dungeons of Hinterberg to grow on me, and that's cause the gameplay itself is all too familiar. Combat is third-person lock-on with light attacks, heavy attacks, a dodge roll, and later on magic. You have to hold A to clear gaps, and climbing is cumbersome due to slowly tapping the A button to move around. Louisa isn't a seasoned adventurer, so I understand not having much grace during a climb, but it was noticeable and annoying. The puzzles with the magic spells are fine for what they are. I had issues getting the timing right on an early puzzle, but after that, I clocked to what the game wanted from me pretty quickly. The mines had some fun cart sequences and an interesting boss, so I'm curious about what each new dungeon brings to the table. Mostly though, it's the friendship journal and the idea of getting to know all the different people in town that pulled me in. Spending time with friends and leveling up those relationships is my favorite part of the Persona games, so I'm curious if I'll find Hinterberg's relationships as fulfilling. If not, at least the vibes and vistas are worth the price of admission. I'm a sucker for detective fiction and science fiction fantasy. I love Blade Runner, Tex Murphy, and the Dresden Files. Was Nobody Wants to Die made specifically for me? We're in future New York City, and like many good detective stories, our protagonist is an old soul watching black and white movies at the drive-thru, in his flying car over Times Square. The hook of this world is that humans have found a way to transfer consciousness between bodies, like an altered carbon. What this means is the rich have taken control and passed legislation mandating that all young people have to be in peak physical and mental condition, and if any infraction happens, their body is auctioned off to the highest bidder. As we start the tale, our detective James Kara is recovering from an accident. We see the effects of it in the car as he has an episode, hallucinating his wife before doubling over in pain, reaching for his medication. The chief of police can't reinstate James just yet, but sends us on a discreet case along with a plucky sidekick who's gunning for a promotion. She'll be our liaison. One of the important people in the city has died, and we're to collect his Icarite off book so he can be reincarnated without scandal. As this is the start of a noir story, obviously things don't go according to plan. The meat of the game is in using reconstruction technology to piece together the crime scene. Not only was this death not an accident, but the victim's Icarite has been fried. This man is dead. We rewind time, analyze clues using UV light and X-ray devices to explore the space, all the while taking in the details and talking to our new partner about everything around us. It's great world building, and the two leads lend strong vocal performances and chemistry to their banter. I enjoyed the methodical process of playing detective and thinking of what the ramifications of this death mean for this world. It also helps that the game looks great. Opening the car door and seeing the skies of Manhattan was a fantastic reveal, but even at the end of my hour, walking the slummy hallways up to our apartment oozed character. It feels that there are loads of tiny interactions one could miss that add to the world building. Yes, the conversation is slow, as is the detectoring, as well as being reliant on controller gimmicks, but for a narrative adventure fusing two genres I love, I think it's a rousing success, and I can't wait to see how much trouble our detective gets himself into. When I was reviewing iPhone games over a decade ago, tower defense games were a dime a dozen. I always found them enjoyable enough, but nothing about the game loop compelled me to keep at them. Actually, I would take any enemy getting through my ranks as a personal insult, so progression became too much of a headache for my perfectionist tendencies. What got me to give Artisan TD a go after all these years is I like the idea of using towers to force the enemies down a different path. The first time I ever encountered the genre was likely a Warcraft 3 mod I used to play with my friends that I think was called Skeeby. That had you shepherding the critters down the longest path possible using your tower placement. So many of the TD games I've played in the past have predetermined paths, and it's all about placing the right towers at the right spots, or more to the point, spamming as many towers as possible, as quickly as possible. The way Artisan TD slowly ramps up the introduction of new tower types and special tiles creates possibilities. It's not always about forcing the enemy along the longest path, but using the terrain and the towers in a creative way. Even though spamming the right combinations in as great a quantity as possible likely becomes the dominant strategy, at least in these earlier levels, it feels like I have choice. At the end of my time with the game, I had 3 tower types: basic damage, slowing the enemy down, and increased damage against armored enemies. What makes things tricky is that there are enemies that don't drop coin, enemies that fly right to the exit, and enemies that will disable towers as they climb over them. Each tower can be upgraded 3 times, and while there's a break between waves where you can make decisions, there's nothing stopping you from building new towers or upgrading old ones in the middle of a wave. And if you need more damage elsewhere or have made a mistake, either sell a tower to rebuild in a new spot, or use the menu to warp back to the start of any wave in the level. I enjoy the overall look of the game, like how the towers link to form a wall when next to each other, but as a game, I find Artisan TD easy enough to jump into and engaging enough to keep me playing. I hardly even use the fast forward option. There is too many decisions to make during each wave. Now, I'm still not smitten with the genre, but every now and then a game will come along to make me say, damn, there are still some cool tower defense games being made. I wonder if something will catch my attention again in another decade or so. I love the watercolor look of Ete. What's even cooler is that as you explore these areas of Montreal, you get to paint them yourself. Painting an object, animal, or plant will add it to your repertoire of inspiration for when you create your own canvases. Landing in this new city, you find yourself in a bare apartment and start selling paintings at the local cafe to make ends meet. There's a daytime cycle, and overnight the town will bid on the paintings, allowing you to collect your earnings the next morning. There are quests given out by the townsfolk, but everything is taken at a leisurely pace. The painting controls are nuanced enough to create something that looks good, giving the player the ability to express themselves, but they're simple enough to learn quickly. Now at the start, you only have access to one color with all its shades. To unlock more, you need to find pigments out in the world. I took a trip to the park and was impressed by how the white expanse spread out to a much larger area than I was expecting. This is where I found the pigments I needed for a new color choice. It feels like a lot of the game will be exploring new areas to find these pigments, alongside the inspiration for all the new paintings you'll make. I say that, but the characters I've run into so far have been well written, so perhaps there's a wider narrative helping people, or at least getting to know the locals better. The only downside is that the game had performance hiccups when the new time of day kicked in, and the loading screens between areas took longer than I would have liked. Both issues might be solved once I upgrade my PC. Oh, and I decided to use a controller because at the time of playing there wasn't an option to reverse the Y-axis when using a mouse. Aside from that, I found the look, the music, the characters, and the laid-back vibes of Ete a delight. I look forward to painting the town red just as soon as I unlock it on the color wheel. Tactical Breach Wizards is a tactics game designed around throwing people through windows. The powers are set up to throw people through windows, and unless a level has no windows, the level is designed to get you to throw people through windows. Of course, there are other ways to take enemies down, but it doesn't feel as satisfying. Once the game introduces optional objectives, every time I took too many turns, failed to steal a door, or didn't make use of the windows, I felt like I wasn't playing the way the game wanted me to. Which is a shame, because Tactical Breach Wizards is well put together. I think there's too much information on the screen, but the levels themselves are clear, with each mission broken down into single screen segments. Between each segment, the characters banter back and forth, discussing the next goal. You select dialogue, and a lot of the writing got a laugh out of me. The tone of the game is serious yet whimsical. This is a political thriller in a world that has magic. There are paramilitary groups, terrorists, and threats of global war. We follow a plucky young PI and a grizzled wizardly veteran as they team up to discover what plot they found themselves embroiled in and to probably stop it from happening. As a tactics game, I appreciate a lot of the allowances given to the player. The wizard has foresight powers, so you can see how an action will play out before committing, and any action can be rewound to the start of the turn. New abilities are unveiled, and level ups allow new attributes to be added to said abilities. It's all about how efficiently you can clear out a room and its windows. Using the windows is so useful that it wasn't until late in my time with the game that I realized Jen the plucky PI didn't actually have any abilities that cause enemies harm. It was all to do with flinging the enemy back a couple of squares. And this is why I won't be continuing with Tactical Breach Wizards. I would clear a room, look at the objectives, and then see that I could have done it in less turns in a much cooler way. Ironically, I don't think I have the foresight to look over the level layout and the tools I have available and concoct a plan that will satisfy not only these bonus objectives, but my own sense of self-worth. Ain't that a breach? Our tastes can be so fickle. UFO 50 is a retro game collection from an alternate timeline, a series of consoles from the 80s, this collection containing 50 games made for them. Yes, 50 full 8-bit games lovingly created with one eye on being faithful to the era and the other on modern design sensibilities. I should love this, right? I'm the guy going through all the NES games year by year, and it's 50 games! If I don't like one, I can move to the next. I have ADHD, so that sounds perfect. Sadly, I found myself disappointed with UFO 50, respecting the idea of it more than being blown away by any of the games I played. Now, the default way to play these 50 games is chronologically. You start from their earliest release and witness the technology and the game design evolve. There's an info tab to get a short background snippet on each game, like who designed it, what this game brought to the industry, and what characters and styles of games you'll see more of down the line. The first game, Barbuta, is designed by Thorsten Petter, and as I made my way through the catalog, I got to play more of his games. Warp Tank, which is the final game I played in my hour with UFO 50, was my favorite of the lot. Mooncat is another Thorsten Petter game, and has the strangest control scheme I've come across, so far. There's some complex and layered strategy games in here. They may not actually be as complex and layered as I perceive them to be, but considering the way the games are presented, and the number of presses it takes on a 2-button controller to do anything, I found myself marveling that such games were in this collection and that there'd be so many of them. So let's end with my favorites out of what I played. Bushido Ball is Samurai Windjammers. It could be a lot of fun with 2 players, as many of the games have an option for a player 2. Mortal was neat because you have a collection of guys to get through the level with, and you have to use their abilities to sacrifice themselves in order to forge ahead. I liked Velgress as it's a reverse downwell, hopping up as many clouds as possible before you get mulched and have to try again. There's Black Koala, a puzzle game that reminded me of the adventures of Lolo. It was fun working out how the blocks interacted with each other, as each new level required experimenting with them in new ways, like a Zachtronics game. Finally, Camouflage is a similar fun puzzle experience, if not a little more fiddly trying to get the lizards lined up on the right surface to get past those damn frogs. I tried 20 out of the 50 games, 40%, and I hardly made progress in any of them. I'm curious about what the rest are, and if we'll continue to follow the legacy of Thorsten Petter. Now the question is, are any of these individual games interesting enough that I'd actually want to play through them? The answer is no. Maybe they're NES length, but for all the love and care that has gone into UFO 50, to me it feels more like a novelty than something I want to spend time to complete. A sampler instead of a full course meal. Still, I guess I could always approach the collection like I do with my NES videos. Let me know if you'd like to see a video like that in the future. When playing Neva, I recognized the inspiration of the games of Fumito Ueda. The titular Neva is a deer dog god companion creature. Early on, Neva will follow its own devices, chasing butterflies or being scared of the darkness. A well-placed call or pet from its owner will set things right, but like Trico in The Last Guardian, it feels like Neva will do what Neva will do. During short combat sections, Neva has been grabbed by the hands of darkness, and it looks like if you're not quick enough, they will take your companion away forever. I'd prefer not to be reminded of the combat sections of Eco, but there you go. All that's left is to scale a giant creature that's doing nobody any harm. Seeing that in the fall chapter I was scaling floating ruins that were breaking apart, I would not be surprised if such a sequence occurs. I bought Neva on release because I loved playing Gris on stream earlier this year, and was willing to give the studio's next game a go. Watching the trailer, I said to myself, yep, this looks like Gris. All the elements are here. The background art and use of color is captivating, as is the music. Most of the gameplay is holding right and jumping, but things get more involved when combat is introduced. It's nothing complex, but it's woven nicely enough alongside the story, creating highs and lows to keep things interesting. The whole game is like that, with new abilities being introduced at regular intervals as you work your way through the seasons of the year. I loved the progression of time as the game moved from summer to fall, because not only did Neva grow, but there's a tangible difference to the land based on what happened previously. But here's where things get less positive. While each element was fantastic, as a whole, I didn't feel engaged. It's like, despite intellectually recognizing how beautiful the art, music, and progression design is, I wasn't feeling it emotionally. I kept waiting for the game to get out of first gear, for something to escalate, to not only show me what the game is about, but what it has to offer. The game got close with the progression of the seasons and the boss fight at the end of summer, but my desire to continue with the game is more a curiosity to see if this potential second gear escalation occurs, rather than being engaged enough to want to return to the world of Neva for its own sake. Ys X Nordics has its main character excited about new adventures. How every new setback that befalls them is embraced with a curiosity rather than self-pity. This is contrasted by a Norman pirate princess getting attached to our hero Adol via some mana handcuffs. Shenanigans ensue. In the hour I spent with Nordics, I felt a tension between the spirit of adventure and the desire for the game to take its time, getting used to the setting and the characters that inhabit it. The brief examples of combat I was able to engage in are fast, fluid, and flashy. Adol can zip around the battlefield, with each slash offering little resistance as it slices through enemies. When shackled to Karja in combat, the two can attack in tandem, automatically nullifying damage when not doling it out themselves. Throw in magic attacks assigned to face buttons, and I wanted to get out and do that RPG thing of killing monsters and acquiring loot for townspeople side quests. I wanted to level up and see how the game deals with gear and upgrades. Alas, this was not meant to be. Seeing the two are shackled together, Karja is forbidden from leaving the town until this problem can be solved, and while Adol was going to join the militia, there's a detour to get Karja some new clothes. It's not that I dislike the characters and dialogue. I think if I had more time to spend on the game, they would grow on me even more than they already have. And I like how the map shows you when you've exhausted all the NPC dialogue by turning their blue dots to gray. It's just that I wanted to see more of the gameplay loop, and to be honest, while I'm positive the game will grow on me, it didn't do much to capture my attention in the time I gave it. I guess it also doesn't help that it was causing my graphics card to tank the frame rate every few minutes. A game like Alan Wake 2 from last year I can understand, but a game that looks like this? Bizarre. Ah well, I've always wanted to get back to playing through Ys 1. Maybe that's a better use of my time. I can find out if the series is engaging enough that I want to work my way up to game number 10. It's been a while since I played a new point-and-click adventure game. In a way, Loco Motive feels like the people who made it are showing off. Despite the low-res pixely style, each area is lavishly designed and full of unique animations for when our protagonist, straight-laced lawyer Arthur Ackerman, interacts with anything. Each line is fully voiced, and the acting is of a high quality to endear us to this cast of colorful characters. The feature that I marveled at is related to the hotspots the player can interact with. Mousing over a hotspot will tell you what it is, but more importantly, how Arthur is going to interact with it. If there is more than one interaction possible, the hotspot will describe what both mouse buttons do. Not only does this eliminate pixel hunting, as it shows which objects are going to be picked up, but the flavor text had me looking at plenty of things on each screen because the interaction sounded fun. Now, with all that said, I was disappointed that the game didn't grab me as strongly as I wanted it to. The premise is fantastic. Arthur is the lawyer to Lady Utervald, traveling on her train, the Rius Express. As she is about to announce who will inherit her vast fortune, the train goes through a tunnel and she's murdered. We jump to the present where Arthur is being grilled by two detectives before jumping back into his testimony to start solving the case, as famed detective Herman Merman has run off.
Herman Merman and the murmuring German. Herman Merman and the squirming Sherman.
It's now classic adventure game fare. Talk to everyone, travel everywhere, and pick up everything not nailed down. Access to certain screens is blocked, creating goals for the player to accomplish along with puzzles to solve. All the right ingredients are here, so what went wrong? I wonder if I finally lost interest in the point-and-click adventure genre. I recognize how well made Loco Motive is, but I found the act of playing it rather flat. Despite the strong voice acting, the timing of the writing was thrown off by it, and I found myself reading the text and clicking through rather than waiting for the voiceover to finish. As a character, I see the comedic potential for Arthur being a clumsy wet blanket, but in my time with the game, he didn't endear himself to me. Maybe I'm just not in the right mood for Loco Motive, and next year or later down the line, I might find myself itching for a new point-and-click adventure game, play it, and love it. Despite not loving it now, I think any fans of the point-and-click adventure genre, or those curious about trying one, should definitely give Loco Motive a go. You know, I'm happy that Loco Motive was the final game of the year, because it helped me understand something about games I thought I was going to love. I can't trust my preconceived notion of past successes anymore. Games in genres that I thought were slam dunks didn't grab me. And even games that looked interesting from their trailers didn't mean that the game would resonate. I spent a lot of the year wondering what was going on, but I knew I wasn't burning out because I still found plenty of games that delighted me. If anything, this year taught me two lessons. The first is that while trailers are still a great way to gauge my interest for a game, the act of playing it is going to be what's important. And speaking of playing, lesson 2 is learning that what interests me most of all this year is the world a game takes place in. How it feels to move through and interact with the space of a game's world. How the game enables me to express myself within it. Now Dave, I hear you say, isn't that the core of playing a game anyway? Yes and no. A game's mechanics and game feel are central to how it performs as a game, yes. But I've never been enamored with mechanics for their own sake. How do they feel to interact with is on my mind, but the more pressing question is how do they allow traversal through the game world itself? And how does the world react to my movement through it? This can be as simple as how tactile it feels to select or place cards or buildings in a strategy game, to walking through a game world as a character, to how jumping, dashing, or fighting allows me to express myself in said game world. My favorite games of the year embodied this idea, and I wonder how my feelings about this will expand or shift as I play through what 2025 has to offer. If you're interested in my top 5 games of 2024, I recommend you head over to the channel Post Game Clarity, or search it on your favorite podcast platform, to experience the 2024 Game of the Year episode. Myself, Dorkax, and Drew Doodle count down our top 5s of the year, explain our reasoning for the placement, argue about where they fall in a giant list of 15, and then talk about our honorable mentions. Having made it through the video you're watching now, you'll have seen me talk about the games I cover in the podcast, with similar points to make on each, but can you guess which were my favorites? The answer may surprise you. Now, if you'd like to support the work I do on this channel, why not head on over to my Patreon? For only $3 a month, you get early access to the videos and written critiques of all the games that I don't turn into videos. You can join for free and read my monthly update newsletter to see how all my projects are progressing. Either way, I appreciate your patronage. I hope you enjoyed this look back at all the games I played in 2024. I plan to do a similar video for 2025, but to hopefully lower the scope and get it out earlier, I'm going to limit myself to games released in 2025 only. Well, including games released in December 2024, because that's when I stopped playing new games, so I could work on getting this video out in a timely manner. I do like covering everything I play regardless of year, but maybe I can bring that back in the future if I get better at managing my time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, give the video a like, leave a comment in response to my opinions about any of the games covered, or tell me the best games you played in 2024. Until next time, I wish all of you a great 2025. I hope you continue to enjoy your gaming and are all having a wonderful day.